So as I said, I'm usually an early modernist. I've been reaching back toward, I worked a lot on early modern mathematics and Platonism, and that's led me to think more about kind of natural philosophy and mathematics in the Platonists themselves, and Proclus, but most recently in Plotinus. I'll talk a little bit about what this project is part of. But I wanted to kind of just to foreshadow the argument I'm going to try to sketch out in this paper, and I'll return to this a couple more times to make sure where I'm going is clear. So essentially, Plotinus has a very peculiar theory of vision based on sympathy, which is quite unlike any other ancient account of vision. But it seems almost naively unworkable in its neglect of what would seem to be fundamental to any such theory, saving the appearances, the phenomena of vision itself. For that reason, as I'll show, every modern commentator has assumed that at some point the sympathy account must be abandoned in order for Plotinus' theory of vision to work as a theory of vision. My argument will be, quite simply, that it does not have to be abandoned. Plotinus has a consistent theory of vision built on the principle of sympathy, which does in fact save the appearance of actual vision. And it is important to take Plotinus' theory seriously. It guarantees the direct, unmediated access of the soul to the world around it, a world which is as real as the world is capable of being, and which discloses the higher intelligible reality on which it depends. And vision is, of course, also the model that Plotinus turns to for understanding intellection. So it matters that we understand what he means by vision itself. Then, okay, so my talk today arises from a volume I'm preparing from the new multi-volume edition of the Enneads from Enneads Press. There's a couple of volumes there. I have this one right here. Many of you will be familiar with this publication project. And my own volume consists of these two very short and largely overlooked natural philosophical treatises. So 2.7, 37 in the chronological ordering, on complete blending. And 2.8, I feel that Plotinus ran out of things to call, Porphyry ran out of things to call. These little scraps of natural philosophical thought on vision, or how it is that distant objects appear small. So there's been a turn in the scholarship over the last couple of decades to take Neoplatonic natural philosophy much more seriously. And so my introductory essays on these treatises try to put them in the context of that newer scholarship and show how even these apparently obscure and very specific natural philosophical topics fit into Plotinus' overall philosophical project. And in part, I argue that these considerations of irreducible physical experiences put Plotinus' metaphysics to the test. Some substances, to give the example of 2.7, some substances just don't mix with other substances, or mix in a way that seems to show that material things, despite their derivative being so close to being nothing at all, nevertheless follow a predictable pattern. And distant things really do reliably seem to be small. In both cases, Plotinus provides an explanation out of his own metaphysical foundations to fill out his account of what physical things are, and thereby, I think, to show that his apparently otherworldly metaphysics is sufficient also to explain the phenomena of our world. I also believe that Plotinus' school in Rome was much more deeply concerned with questions of the nature of bodies and embodiment than is usually thought. The nature and behavior of bodies and the embodiment of the soul were motivating questions both in the discussions in the classroom and in the Enneads themselves. And because of that, the connection between the soul and the world in which it moves when embodied, sense perception, continues to need further attention from modern scholars. Next slide. So the two short treatises that I've been editing, translated, come in the middle of Plotinus' most philosophically creative period. So here we have this kind of middle period of Plotinus' work. We see this great work, 4.3 to 4 and 4.5, the huge problems concerning the soul, one of the largest works in the whole of the Ennead, when we put it back together. And then, so gross shrift, starting with 3.8 on nature contemplation and the one, and ending with 2.9 against the Gnostics, which Porphyry helpfully sliced into pieces and scattered all over the place for modern scholars to try and put back together. But that's very much one of his greatest, most substantial works. And here we have, in the middle of those kinds of works, and some of these truly great works of metaphysics down here, these little things here, the coda, to problems concerning the soul, on vision itself, on sight, this little fragment about vision, and on complete blending. So they really do occur in the middle of one of Plotinus's most creative periods. The tiny treatise on vision, 2.8, that precipitates some of this thought today, is, I argue, an appendix to this vast treatise on the soul, and directly relates to the theory of vision set out in 4.5. So there's a unity across these multiple treatises, a single conception of what it is to see things. But the more I read scholarship on Plotinus visual theory, the more convinced I was there was a fundamental misunderstanding of how it actually worked. Next slide. Okay, so again, just to give an overview of what I'm going to be trying to argue today, Plotinus has, as I've said, a peculiar theory of vision based on sympathy, which is quite unrelated, it seems, to any other account in antiquity of how vision works. But it seems almost naively unworkable in its neglect of what would seem to be fundamental to any such theory, saving the appearances, the phenomena of vision itself. It seems to give us nothing that other theories give us very easily. The directionality of vision, the perception of the forms of the objects, even the function of the eye itself. It does not save the appearances of appearances themselves. The solution has been, as I'll show in a moment, to make Plotinus a crypto-Aristotelian, to assume, in other words, that he was never really serious about putting sympathy at the foundation of vision. And in actual fact, he must smuggle in somewhere the reception of forms into the eye, which is the crucial step that always collapses Plotinus in modern accounts into being an Aristotelian, as I'll show. So my thesis is that this last step, solution to make him an Aristotelian, is illegitimate, and is very explicitly denied by Plotinus several times in the Enneads. Plotinus does have a consistent theory of vision built on the principle of sympathy, which does actually save all the appearances of real vision. So in this paper, I cannot do more than sketch some aspects of that theory, and I'll be pleased to go into more details of the whole thing in the question and answers. But as the title of this paper suggests, I'm going to focus on just one tiny element of any visual theory worth its salt, the function of the eyes. What do they actually do? This is a crucial question. Blumenthal, in his fundamental monograph on the modern soul, threw up his hands in despair that Plotinus did not seem to provide any useful details about the function of any sense organ, including the eye. That silence allowed Blumenthal, and later scholars who followed him, to assume that it did what anyone would expect an eye to do, that is, receive the forms or species of visual objects. As I'll show in this paper, that is not what eyes do. What they actually do is rather unexpected, but is a coherent part of his strange but brilliant account of vision. And before I move on, I should repeat again that it's important to take Plotinus' theories seriously, however strange it is. As I mentioned earlier, vision is, of course, the model that Plotinus turns to for understanding intellection. So it matters that we understand what he means by vision. Moreover, his visual theory is in close critical dialogue with all the other ancient theories, especially Aristotelian and Stoic. In opposition to those theories, Plotinus is concerned to guarantee the direct, unmediated access of the soul to the world around it, a world which is as real as the world is capable of being, and which discloses the higher intelligible reality from which it depends. Understanding better how the visual theory allows it to happen will, I think, lead us to deeper insights into the nature of perception of intelligibles as well. Okay, so go ahead then to the next one. Right. So into the more substantial part of the paper. So let's begin by reminding ourselves of the two main types of visual theory in antiquity, both of which Plotinus rejects. So we have, in broad categories, extravision on the one hand. Vision takes place by the eye sending out something, right? Sending out something from the eye to the visual object. I've noticed Stoics, Plato, mathematical optics. I should have put Galen in there as well. All of these authors, either in the case of Euclid and Ptolemy, for instance, or mathematical opticians, have a kind of a mathematical abstraction, which perhaps, for Ptolemy at least, is related to Stoic pneuma. Plato has an idea of the fire in the eye, which is sent out and coalesces with daylight to make a kind of a feeling body that connects to visual objects. And in all of these cases, in all of these cases, vision is reduced, in a sense, to a species of touch. So the shape of the visual object must be inferred from how we encounter it through this basically extension of the eye out into the world. So the Stoics, rather infamously, compared vision to a pair of sticks that a blind man would use to feel an object, and Descartes will use that same image in the Dioptrique as well. So that's one of the main theories. The other one, Aristotle, the Epicureans, of course, Plotinus pays no attention to the Epicureans, but has a lot to say about Aristotle. A notion of intromission, that the eye takes in something from the outside world. So for Plotinus, both of these major classes of theories present a problem. So if the eye sends out something, some kind of ray or pneuma that feels a visible object, it will have to infer from that tactile exploration the visible properties of the thing. But, and Plotinus emphasizes this several times, that is not how vision seems to us. We look at something and we just see it. There is no kind of extra level of inference or thinking through between our encounter with the world outside and its direct presentation to the soul. And nor is intromission any better, because in this case, we would now be cut off from the things themselves in the world, and instead we would be left with representations of things which we encounter at the eye. But again, however, we seem to see the things themselves, and as Plotinus, we see them where they are, not at the eye. We'll get onto that more in a moment. So in both of these cases, Plotinus insists upon the phenomenology of vision, that it is unmediated and puts the perceiving soul in contact with things themselves as they are, and not with mere representations or inferred descriptions of them. And it undermines the passivity of either the perceiving soul or the visual object that is implied by each of these kinds of theories. Both, he insists, both the perceptive soul and the visible objects are active. And this too is phenomenologically grounded. Sense perception is, says Plotinus, just what it seems to be, a reaching out beyond ourselves such that we perceive things directly where they are. The tree I see through my window across the quad is actively present, and my soul responds to it, coming to know it in its place, rather than in my eyeball, for instance, through some indirect impression. Plotinus sets out then to say the appearances, the phenomenology of vision more accurately than the theories of his physical rivals, philosophical rivals can do. Next slide, please, Ben. Oh, is that all it is? Okay. Let's begin with sympathy then. All right. Next slide again. All right. So sympathy. And I know this is something that many of you are already familiar with, but let me just kind of introduce you very briefly to sympathy as it appears in Plotinus' natural philosophy, in particular in part 2 of Problems Concerning the Soul, 4.4, which is where the most dense consideration of sympathy occurs. Okay, so what is sympathy? I'm very aware that there could be an entire paper on nothing but that and its relation in particular to Stoic ideas of sympathy. So I'll make this very brief just to give us a sense of what sympathy means for Plotinus within the Enneads and what kinds of contexts he finds it to be useful and interesting. Okay, so 4.32, chapter 32 onwards, this is the place he introduces sympatheia in this great treatise on the soul. And essentially, it is the means by which two products of the same soul or the same world soul act upon each other at a distance. So some examples might be within a human body, obviously ensouled by a single soul, right? There might be the way in which the example he gives is pain traveling from one place to another, or our reaction to touching a torpedo fish and how that affects the rest of the body. Classic examples from ancient natural philosophy. How does that happen? It happens through this kind of sympathy that our parts of the body are in some kind of resonance with each other because they've been created by the soul. But more broadly, we're all products of the same world soul, at least insofar as we are bodies. We are products of the same world soul, and the bodies within the cosmos are all products of one single unified soul. So in that case, he says this is the reason he's interested in it here is it explains certain things that are puzzling about our relationship to the planets, to the heavenly bodies, which are, of course, gods. One of them is astrological influences. Why is it that certain planets, Saturn and Mars, can have baleful influences? Why are different aspects to each other? Do they give different effects? Are they thinking about things? Are they planning things out? All of this seems absurd to Plotinus. And prayer. He said, what happens when I pray to the gods, in particular to the planetary gods? They can't be affected, they can't be changed. So what exactly is the effect of prayer? Why does prayer, for instance, change me when I pray to a particular deity? So he, having set out the problematic, why sympathy is of interest within the field of natural philosophy, Plotinus goes on to give us some very important details about what kind of a thing sympathy is. So, of course, for the Stoics, sympathy is related to tonos, the kind of stretching or compression of pneuma. For Plotinus, it's just another way of talking about the doctrine of double activity. So the fact that anything which has an internal activity by Plotinus, from Plotinus' perspective, is going to have a secondary activity that stretches out beyond it. The most obvious example is the activity, if one can call it, of the one, or of nous, or of soul itself, all of which is going to lead to what's called emanation, right? So the primary activity is what nous is doing, as it were, but what it does effortlessly is to radiate soul beyond it, and the soul is the secondary activity of nous. And this is general. For Plotinus, every single activity of any kind must have some kind of external double activity that's associated. So, in this case, that's what sympathy is. The primary activity of the sun, for example, leads to an effortless secondary activity on products of the same world. So astrological influence is just the sun, being a god, being a particular kind of noetic thing, with its own internal activity, radiates beyond itself an influence, which is what turns up to us as being sympathetic connection. The other example here is So the other example here is magical spells. He's very interested about how magic works. Magic works within the cosmos. It works on bodies. It's our higher intellect is free from the effects of magic, but Plotinus has no doubt that it works, right? That magical spells are a way. The magician, in a sense, is aware of sympathies that can be applied to things, what medieval theories of magic call the application of actives to passives. And finally, let's just read this passage here, which I think is an interesting one, because it tells us a little bit about a kind of more common analogy that Plotinus wants us to think about. But the sun or another planet does not actually hear the prayer. Okay, obviously, the sun is not listening to our prayers and responding to our wishes. The effect thus happens in accord with the prayer because one part comes into sympathy with another, just as in a single stretched string, when plucked at the lower end, the higher end vibrates as well. It also often happens when one string is plucked, another has a kind of feeling by the harmony of being tuned to the same scale. So we can imagine two lyres, and this is attested in other ancient texts as well. They're across the room from each other, you pluck a string on one lyre loud enough, and at the other end of the room, the lyre, the same string starts vibrating in sympathy times. But if the vibration in one lyre so passes to another, insofar as there is a sympathy between them, even more so in the all is there a single attunement. So the tuning of things by the world soul allows these immediate reactions to happen over vast distances, and there is no direct causal connection between them. There is no material kind of medium that is making one thing happen to the other. It's simply through the very act of things being attuned to each other, an action over here will cause an action over there. Next slide, Ben. Oh, that's two, I think. Okay, and this is the curious thing, right? Plotinus' vision is brought about through sympathy. So here's many passages, but 4.5 is the treatise that really sets out clearly a theory of vision based on sympathy. At the beginning of that treatise, he says, in any case, the argument is arguments about how vision takes place, maybe linked to the sympathies mentioned. Remember, this is the same traits originally as 4.4. So if this organ, the eye, is by its nature thus affected sympathetically by this object, because it has a certain similarity to it. So vision is a setting up of similarity between an eye on the one hand and a visible object. We'll talk more about what similarity is in a moment. And here's a famous kind of beautiful paradox that Plotinus considers. But what if there were a body outside the heavens and some eye from here were looking with nothing hindering? Would it see anything if it had no sympathetic link to that body, if in fact sympathy is due to the nature of a single living thing? Any guesses or knowledge as to whether we could in fact see beyond another cosmos? The answer is no. Okay, so very puzzlingly, he says, imagine being at the very edge of the universe. There's another cosmos over there. Can you see it? It seems you should be able to see it. And he says, no, you can't see it because if it's another cosmos, it has a different world soul. There cannot be any resonant sympathy between my eye and the products of that world. So you simply wouldn't see it. And he denies the possibility of the question. I want to just point out here in passing that what he says here about the limitation of vision is precisely what he says about the limitations of magic in 4.4, right? In 4.4, he says very categorically, on the one hand, the magician can only affect common products of the same world soul, by which he means not nous, not our intellect, but it can affect our bodies. He says also that it cannot affect something outside of the cosmos. So magic too is limited within the one cosmos in precisely the same way that visions. Next slide, please. Okay, in 4.6, a slightly later treatise on memory and sense perception, which is a kind of supplement to the great work on the soul, Plotinus emphasizes throughout that perception is a power of the soul which enables it to go out and encounter things beyond it. And memory is a closely related power of the soul that brings those things back into presence one more, even when they're absent. So if we just go through this passage here, so acquisition of memories, the soul knows the intelligibles at first dimly, are mudros, and then through increasing familiarity, is able to bring them back into presence, parousia, before it. In the same way, the soul makes the objects of sense, which are, so to speak, connected with it, shine out, one might say, by its own power, and brings them before its eyes, since its power of sense perception is ready for them, and in a way, in travail towards them. So perception is a movement of the soul beyond itself, towards a thing with which it is in sympathy. It encounters the thing's secondary activity, and, at least in the case of vision, perceives the object at the object. Sense perception is just what it seems to be to us, a reaching out beyond ourselves, such that we perceive things directly where they are. So to use that same example, this tree in the distance is actively present, and my soul responds to it, coming to know it in its place, rather than my eyeball from an indirect impression. Perception is an act of knowing. In perceiving the tree in this way, certain innate notions are activated as I hold it in presence before my soul. And it is in these activated notions of the soul, which Plotinus identifies with the fantasia, that sense perception comes to its end. Okay, next slide. But why, might we ask, given the possibilities of ancient visual theory, would Plotinus turn to sympathy, to a kind of response to presence by the soul as the basis of his theory? This very brief sketch of the nature of sympathy hardly seems to recommend it as the foundation for a visual theory. Why choose this nebulous influence as the basis of a theory that has to explain things like, why do I see along straight lines? Why can't I see through walls or behind my head? How do I perceive shapes and colors accurately? The inspiration lies, I believe, partly with Alexander of Aphrodisias' developments from Aristotle's account of sense perception. So I've got two different accounts here. The first in De Anima, his work De Anima, not a commentary on De Anima, but Alexander's own work De Anima, which is one that keeps very, very close to Aristotle, while emphasizing in a very Alexandrian way more strongly the physical basis of vision. So color in De Anima is a kind of movement in the transparent, The sense organ receives that color and is altered by it, taking on its likeness. The change that happens in the sense organ is then communicated to the governing part, the hegemonicon, the faculty that is near the heart, all of which you could extract very easily from De Anima, from Aristotle's De Anima and De Sensu et Sensato. It's just a kind of a digest in which Alexander, being Alexander, very much emphasizes the physicality of the eye actually changes color and takes on the form, which is going to be then physically transmitted to this thing that is near my heart, right? But he has a very different account in the Mantissa, the supplement to De Anima. So the section on vision, which forms the central part of the Mantissa, is most likely taken from Alexander's lost work on how we see, which is almost certainly known to Plotinus, since this is the same subtitle with exactly the same phrasing that was attached to his own work on vision 4.5. This is a far more subtle account than the one found in the De Anima itself. In this work, Alexander follows Aristotle in saying that light is the primary actuality of the transparent. The presence of a luminous object in the potentially transparent medium, in other words, makes it actually transparent. But, he adds, this actualized transparency has a second activity, color. And he said, to quote, color, did I put this down here? I did not put this down here, but the actual quote is, color affects the actually transparent just as light does the potentially transparent. So to give an example, air is potentially transparent. It cannot be seen through in the dark, that is, unless there is a luminous source within it, which makes it actually transparent. We can now perceive things at a distance within the medium, and this becoming actually transparent is what we mean by the word light, says Aristotle and Alexander. Once it has become actually transparent, the presence of a colored object can affect the medium in a strictly analogous way. The same applies to the pupil of the eye. It is potentially transparent, and when made actually transparent by light, it can be affected by colors. So then, does the medium become colored in the presence of light and a colored object? Alexander affirms that the colors are, in a sense, in the medium. We can experience as much by holding a white object near something that is colored boldly red or purple. The colors in the medium seem to paint, as he says, the object. But the analogy that Alexander draws between color and light allows him to give a more subtle account of the inness of the colors in the transparent. Light, even according to Aristotle, is not really in the transparent at all. It is not any sort of quality, still less is it a body. It is simply an actualization brought about by the presence of the luminous, a kind of response to presence. It is thus, Alexander adds, something more like a relation, that is, between a potentially transparent body and a luminous object. And so too, then, he adds, are colors, the primary object of vision. They also are a kind of a relation between the colored object and the actually transparent medium. Thus, the regions around a colored object are activated by the color, but not changed into that color. The same must apply to the transparent pupil as well. Alexander explains it with this analogy. I'll just read out this quote from the Mantissa. For the transparent is not affected by the objects of sight, as it is not by light either. For neither for us is to be in the light, to be affected, but it seems that to be illuminated and to be colored come about for transparent things in much the same way as contemplation, where the inquirer finds the answer and has understanding simultaneously, as if the intellect came into contact and came to have understanding merely through the presence of the object of understanding. Thus, the parts of the medium that are affected by colors are not, strictly speaking, affected by them at all. Rather, they stand in relation to the presence of the colored object, much as our own minds stand in relation to an object of knowledge. This spiritual reading of Aristotle, as Sirachji has called it and has argued, is similar to the doctrine of intentional species in medieval philosophy. Finally, Alexander states that the eye takes in the form without the matter. Again, this is from De Anima Book 2, Aristotle's De Anima Book 2, and that's a thoroughly Aristotelian position. But in the spiritual reading, it is more like the eye receives something closer to information about the presence, the parousia of the visible object and its relation to part of this transparent medium, including its relation to the eye itself, rather than being physically changed as it is in the animal, right? So there's a crucial difference there. Alexander goes on to use this theory, derived from Aristotle's but quite distinct from it, to solve some puzzles in the theory of vision, such as why do we see things in a straight line? How do the appearances of things cross in midair without becoming confused? And we don't need to follow him down all of those paths. I just want to point out here some of the crucial work that Alexander does for Plotinus. Alexander provides the clue through which Plotinus is able to avoid the limitations of both intromission and extromission. Plotinus agrees with him that vision requires the presence, the parousia, of a visible object, which is active within the region in which it is visible. That is, within the region of its secondary activity or its sympathetic action. Vision is just a kind of awareness of that activity or a thought about it, rather than the taking in of a colored form. For Alexander, the eye does, in the end, take in or take on some kind of information about the visible object. And it is on precisely that last point that Plotinus departs from his account. So then, what do eyes actually do, Ben? Next slide. There it is, what eyes do. Let's keep going. All right, so let's begin by considering the scholarly consensus. I just want to give these examples of, very great works on Plotinus, which nevertheless collapse into an Aristotelianism at the end. So here we have Blumenthal in 1971, his work on the embodied soul, in which he just refers in passing to the Aristotelian theory of vision on which his own Plotinus is based. And here we go on a little bit further, a few pages later. While Plotinus says explicitly that vision encounters the object directly, and that vision happens at the object, in fact, says Blumenthal, correcting Plotinus, as we shall see, the soul does not see the objects directly on Plotinus's own theory of vision. The soul receives a kind of translation of the impression by which the body is affected. Today, we should think in terms of electrical impulses traveling along nerves. It is these impressions in the body and its organs that soul perceives. So far, very Aristotelian, so far, very, I'm going to say, Aristotelian. Emilson, in 2017, his volume on Plotinus, let us reaffirm that in the case of vision, the affections consist in the eyes receiving the colors of the thing seen, or to put it differently, the assimilation of the organ to the external sensible consists somehow in the eyes becoming qualified by the colors of the thing. So again, we collapse at the end of his account of visual theory of science to be saying he's an Aristotelian, right? And I should add here that in other ways, very illuminating 2015 article on the nature of sympathy, Emilson says that in the case of vision, sympathy is just a kind of metaphor for the transmission of visual forms through the intervening space. So Emilson goes so far, even in this extraordinarily good account of what sympathy means at both the Stoics and in Plotinus, to say, yeah, but when it comes to vision, he uses the word sympathy, but it just means an Aristotelian transmission of forms. It's a kind of a metaphor that he's using at that point. Gary Girdler in 2018, not in this book, but in an article that came out a year after this edition of the work on vision. The similarity between the organ and the object sets up a relation between them which certain accidental conditions obtain. They are near one another and lined up directly. The body between is dissimilar and thus not affected. And so the form of the object passes through the interval to the organ without being impeded. So Girdler, having just translated and commented thoroughly on 4.5 and the key passages on sympathy for the same series, comes closer than anyone to actually take sympathy seriously as a basis for vision. But even he slips up from time to time, as here, where sympathy does not actually cause vision, but at most sets up the conditions for vision to take place by thoroughly Aristotelian means. Okay, that's next one. Okay, great. So there's one passage in the whole Enneads in which Plotinus considers explicitly the function of sense organs. And this is in 4.4.23. So he begins by insisting on the necessity of a sense organ for sensation. But the soul on its own, even if it were possible for it to focus on a sensible object, would end up with the understanding of an intelligible one, with a sensible object escaping it, since it does not have the wherewithal to grasp it. So if the soul were without these organs, eyes, hands, ears, all these other sense organs, then if it could, in fact, be aware of sensible objects, it would be aware of them as intelligibles and not as sensible objects. As Collegas, Christian Wilberg, Carlo Caradonna have all argued over the last couple of decades, physical objects are, for Plotinus, just a special kind of intelligible entity. They are logoi, active on the surface of matter, and special in the sense that, unlike every other intelligible, they cannot give rise to further intelligibles. Rather, their secondary activity produces sensible qualities. So in this first passage, Plotinus is saying that the soul by itself might be aware of external objects, but only in their intelligible structure as logoi. It could not grasp their secondary activity, which becomes present to us as qualities, and this distinction will be important. So what do these organs actually do? Here we have the second passage, and you'll see some troublingly Aristotelian language, which I'll address in a moment. When the soul sees a visible object from a distance, even when it has come to the soul as far as possible as a form, although when it arrives at the soul, it is at first like something without parts, yet it finishes with the underlying color and shape. When the soul sees everything that is there, this is a tortured sentence in Greek, and there have been as many translations. Brahier, in his French translation, just kind of wildly paraphrases because it's difficult to see how those sentences even fits together. What is going to be affected must be a third thing, and that is what will receive the form. Okay, so we have some very Aristotelian language here. And what I want to say here is that Plotinus begins, as he often does, when introducing a new subject in the Enneads, by using very Aristotelian language. And this passage has, in fact, been one of those texts used to argue that his theory of vision must essentially be Aristotelian. But as so often, I'll show this in a moment, Plotinus quickly abandons the principles underlying the Aristotelian language and re-inhabits the language with his own theory and meaning. So let's get to the next slide. So what the eye actually does not involve receiving the form at all. So this is later on in that same chapter, after having begun with an account which says in very simplistic Aristotelian terms, the soul, the sense organ receives the form of the object. Okay, so I'm going to read this out because I think this is a crucial passage. One can see, after all, that artificial tools serve to mediate between those making judgments and the things that are being judged, and report to the maker of the judgment the particularity of the underlying objects. A ruler, for example, connects the straightness in the soul with that in the wood, being placed between the two, and so gives the craftsman the ability to judge the object he is crafting. So Plotinus is clearly inspired here by Plato's statement in the first Alcibiades that the body is an instrument of the soul, and he takes this metaphor here quite literally. In the act of vision, the eye acts for the soul, just as a straight edge acts for a craftsman. So let's kind of unpack what that would mean. So the puzzle about the eye in all ancient visual theory was whether it was active or passive, whether we have extramission or intramission. And as we've just seen, Plotinus' theory is often assimilated to the essentially passive theory of Aristotle. The eye receives the form, something that Plotinus himself, as we just saw, seems to say at the very beginning of this chapter. But let's take the analogy of the craftsman's ruler seriously. Is a ruler active or passive? It would seem to be odd to characterize it as simply either of those two. What does it do, and how does it work? It judges the straightness of a piece of wood and does so by virtue of its own straightness. It is immediate. The ruler does not deliberate over the straightness or crookedness of objects. It makes and reports that judgment to the soul of the craftsman simply by being what it is. Straightness in the wood is announced directly to us from the ruler's being straight. The rule was not changed in the act of encountering the wood's straightness. In fact, if it were, it would cease to be useful as a ruler. And it is capable of telling us about the straightness of the wood because it is not an entirely neutral tool, like a hammer, for example. It already knows something about the world, namely it knows about straightness and crookedness. But when it is held up against the piece of wood, it cannot express its active knowing by itself. It needs something else, the carpenter or the carpenter's soul, in order to say what it has discovered. Conversely, the carpenter cannot make any accurate judgment about straightness and crookedness without the ruler. And the eye occupies exactly this kind of middle instrumental role. As the soul reaches out to perceive objects that it is in sympathy with, fellow products of the world soul, the eye assesses and announces them to the soul qua visual. What in the rule of straightness is in the eye the connection it has to things that are colored and illuminated through itself being colored and illuminated, filled with light. Its form is light, as Plotinus says in one place, ophthalmos photoedes. The eye judges not by being affected, but by being something that can actively announce light and color. It is different from the ruler, Plotinus notes immediately after this passage, only by the fact that it is able to make the judgment instantly at a distance, rather than by direct application. And how it does that is what he will answer later in the treatise, in 4.5, by means of sympathy. That's why we don't have to place our eye against a colored object. Sympathy allows us to make those judgments of light and color from a distance. The eye judges sympathetically because it shares the luminous nature of what it sees, just as the ruler judges because it shares straightness with the wood. It does so with a kind of passivity, by simply being light-filled and colored, by being what it is, but not by receiving their forms into itself. It is not changed in perception, and equally, it is active in announcing the visual aspect of the object's secondary activity. And the same goes for the other sense organs, by the way. For Plotinus, the senses are unified. They simply announce thoughts to the soul in different sensory modes in response to the same single presence or secondary activity. This is why Plotinus also doesn't need a common sense or a monicon in the same way that Alexander does, because the senses are already unified. There's a single secondary activity, which is the presence of the sensible body, which we just have reported to us in 5 different ways, according to which sense announces it. So go ahead and get Ben to the next slide. The Aristotelian sounding theory at the beginning of 4.4.23 is just the jumping off point towards Plotinus' own theory, in which he will reshape the original provisional account, the Aristotelian account, in part by repurposing the meanings of the words. The sense organ is affected, peisomenon, and receives the form. And this is interpreted to mean that it, in fact, impassively acts as a standard to announce immediately the presence of the object qua visible. So in the course of 4.4, Plotinus says what I originally started out by saying this organ is affected. By the word affected, I mean it acts as a standard and announces. So I re-inhabit the word. It would be too long a digression here to point out that, yes, Plotinus regularly re-inhabits Aristotelian and Stoic language to his own ends. He uses their terms of art homonymously. He can, in a way, affirm their theory in their own words, while each word means something different to him. So to give just one other example here, just read this out. But first of all, one would object that impressions, tupoi, a word that appears again and again and again in Plotinus' theory, are not things with magnitude, nor are they like ceilings or resistances to pressure or the makings of impressions, which is literally what tupoi are. But the way it happens is like intellection. Even in the case of sense objects, that's a crucial kind of writing. So even in sense perception, when I talk about impressions, what I mean is a thought. And every time I say the word tupoi, think of thoughts instead. So in this passage, just before, prior to this, when discussing the Aristotelian account of memory, Plotinus almost seems to affirm the notion that the soul receives the impressions of things outside of it, but then quite explicitly corrects that reading. For, as he confirms, said in several other places in the Enneads, when he says impressions, he means something like thoughts, and explicitly wants us to think about where we might expect impressions to be impressions. For instance, in an eyeball, the impressions are in fact also thoughts, not actual physical impressions. Next one there. Oh, conclusions. Okay, I've nothing to say about that, but let's move on to the next one. Okay, so in my larger project, I argue that the theory of sympathy and the function of the eye is consistently present throughout the Enneads, at least after the composition of the great treatise on the soul. It lies behind the tiny little treatise I've been concerned with, 2.8, on the appearance of things at a distance. And although I can't demonstrate this here, it does in fact save all the phenomena of sight. So if we sift through the way in which Plotinus talks about sight in his own account of sympathy and an eye that acts as a kind of impassible standard, All of these things in various places are explained. The perception of form and color in the soul, why things appear smaller as they get further away, the sort of 2.8, the role of ambient light and vision. That doesn't seem at all clear why we do need light if vision happens through sympathy. Science gives us an explanation of that. The rectilinearity of vision and light. Again, why should this kind of amorphous kind of influence happen along straight lines? Science gives us an account of that in passing, at least. Why I can't see behind my head or through a wall, a kind of important thing to know. Plotinus clarifies that as well. And this last one I think is really, really interesting. Why we see a visual image in the pupil. And I want to pause on just this point today because it's so strange and ingenious at the same time. So as Aristotle and almost every optical theorist after him noted, one can see a representation of the visual field in the chora, in the pupil, right? For Aristotle, this was the change in the sense organ that enabled sight to happen and was an observable sign of the reception of the form of the visible object without its matter. So I argue that for Plotinus, believes the process happens in the opposite direction. He suggests more than once that the sense organs are impassible in the act of perception itself. They don't change when they see or hear. And if the eye functions like a straight edge to the craftsman, one would expect it not to be changed when it perceives. Then why do we observe apparent affections in the eye and the other organs? In one passage, he seems to say that the images in the eye, which we can all observe by looking at other people's eyes, are images caused by the perceived forms in the soul and not by the visible object itself. They are, in other words, a kind of physical byproduct of the real perception which happens immediately in the soul with the eye as an instrument, but the eye as an instrument like a straight edge and not like a magnifying glass or a mirror, which is a better analogy for the Aristotelian or the Alexandrian account of the action of the eye. And this is an analogy, by the way, there's an analogy here, by the way, to the late Neoplatonic theory of the fantasia, in which images of intelligibles appear as an unintended byproduct of the actions of the soul, as Tyrianus and Proclus both say, that it happens parahypostatically, kind of parasitically, but in fact, the fantasy was never meant to show images of what's happening in dianoia, but it happens to, and it happens to be useful. And that's exactly what's happening, I think, for Plotinus in the eye. We see the visual theory in other people's eyes, the visual field in other people's eyes, but it's actually being caused by their soul as an unintended byproduct of the act of vision. Okay, last slide, I think. Okay, so what? So I am at heart a historian of science with an abiding interest in the history of optics from antiquity to the Renaissance. So in that sense, one great satisfaction for me has been to recover a complete theory of vision from antiquity that is neither extramissive nor intromissive, and yet seems to save certain phenomena of vision better than any other, in particular the directness of vision, even though at first glance it seems to save none of them. And as someone who is interested in phenomenology as well, Plotinus' theory seems to have a more profound concern with appearances, paradoxically, than any other ancient theory. He is genuinely interested in preserving the immediacy of vision, the sense that we are given things in perception without any interpretive filter, the feeling that we encounter things just where they are and not in our eyes or in our heads, and a disclosure of the nature of things that appearances open up for us. Not coincidentally, I think, his account of depth perception, in particular, is almost identical to that of Merleau-Ponty's. And this is in part a consequence, I think, of Plotinus' doctrine that there are no substances in the world, no enmatted forms at all. Substances are in nous. What we encounter here around us are the activities of substances, logoi, whose activity gives rise to the secondary activity of qualities or appearances. Thus, for Plotinus, appearances are all that we have. Unlike an Aristotelian who can say we can find a form in nature, Plotinus specifically denies that. He takes appearances seriously because they are what are present to the soul, and they lead the soul back to their source, the intelligible world. And finally, as I've suggested, a better understanding of the mechanism of vision might aid us in interpreting Plotinus' visual metaphors for intellection. To give just one example, from a treatise I've already cited, In 4.6, Plotinus compares the formation of memories to the viewing of an object from a distance and up close. He's pushing back at the Aristotelian notion that memories are impressions in the soul left by impressions in the sense organs. His argument only makes complete sense, however, if we understand that this treatise, written at the end of the suite of essays on natural philosophy, is assuming the visual theory that is built up in those essays. 2 points in particular. Unless one understands that the eye itself is impassible, does not change in the act of vision, that it doesn't receive anything, but instead announces judgments qua visual, the analogy to how the impassible soul understands intelligibles is very difficult to follow through. And the account of the appearance of intelligibles that are near or far with respect to the soul is entirely based on the theory of, in 2.8, of why distant objects look small. So these two things come together in an odd way. 2.8, which seems to be such a fiddly, pointless little essay to be writing about, is in fact our clue to why, when we first encounter intelligibles, they appear to us to be, as it were, small and dim until we become habituated to seeing them properly. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you for that wonderful paper. If I could just to start off the conversation to ask you about the relationship of this account of sympathy with sympathy and the rest of his metaphysics. It's a very important notion for Plotinus's thought. Obviously, again, the Stoic influence, but going back to the Timaeus, but clearly very different from that of the Stoics. And the points you were hinting at the end of your paper, I think, about the relationship between the sensible and the noetic, i.e., those passages where Plotinus will describe a continuum between the sensible and the noetic.
Yes.
So, what are our sensory experiences but dim intellections?
Mm-hmm.
Now, given his sense of the noetic realm as this dynamic plenitude of powers, then your account makes much more sense than this sort of quasi-Aristotelian passivity in perception. So I just wondered whether...
take those, if I understand the question, Douglas. I think that the kind of reassessment of what bodies are for Plotinus, that they are not, that's another example I could have given from Blumenthal as well, about in 1972, the radical distinction between the things that are beyond the body or beyond the soul, and the things that are encountered kind of intellectually. That's, I think, in the modern scholarship being kind of, as you say, it's a continuum now. It's greatly eroded. There are no, as it were, physical objects that are distinguished by being purely physical. We live, as Wilberg says in his great article, in a world of thoughts, right? So we're surrounded by thoughts, which are the last kind of thinking through of they're the secondary activities in the sense of the world soul contemplating nous. But they are self-intelligible. So we're surrounded by intelligible things, the logoi, which have the secondary activity, which is in a way still intelligible. They're bundles of qualities, right? But they're bundles of qualities that can only be perceived as qualities by the sense organ. So in that sense, I think that, if we think about what are the analogies between kind of the mode of intellection and the mode of sense perception, I think it becomes much more collapsed. And the reason, and what I would argue more strongly, is that it's not that Plotinus is saying, hey, seeing the forms in nous is a little bit like seeing an object with our eye, in the way that Plato does, let's say, in the divided line, or the analogy of the sun. He's saying they really are, in some sense, the same thing, but they're on a different schedule, but they're on a different spectrum only insofar as the objects of sense perception are intelligibles that can't create other intelligibles. They're kind of a dead-end intelligible. So that kind of makes it much easier to see how Plotinus is flowing from analogies of sense perception through to understanding how the human intellect works. The first question on sympathy, what precisely were you thinking about in terms of the other places where he's using sympathy beyond magic and
well, I think the notion of the world soul,
yeah,
of course, the centrality of the world soul, and indeed thinking of 3-8 and the whole conception of nature as slumbering spirit.
Yeah, yes, so absolutely. So there's and nature dropping out of itself, the logoi, right? In its contemplation, is kind of sleeping, dropping out of these, and that's why they can't create any more intelligence beyond them, because they come out of this kind of somnolent contemplation of nature itself, right? And I think what I'm trying to argue here is that we have to take seriously, as I think other scholars haven't taken seriously, that it's precisely the same sympathy, right? That it's precisely the same sympathy that is going to explain physical effects in the world, in particular, what Plotinus says to be undoubted physical effects like magic, the transmission of pain and pleasure through a body, astrological influences. All of these things seem to him to be trivially true. And part of what any natural philosophy has to explain. Sympathy does that very well. And it's exactly the same sympathy which is just explaining the act of vision. And this is again where I think every other commentator has tried to insist that, in this case, this is a different kind of sympathy. He's using the word, but he doesn't mean it seriously. But it is exactly the same sympathy, which is why vision can only happen within a single world soul as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Isidoros has a question. Father,
Hi,
Isidoros.
thank you very much. Hi, greetings from Athens. Thank you for this very illuminating talk. I suppose my question is very basic. In terms, the question I had initially was from, the question a student of Descartes would have to the master, namely, how is information translated, how is physical information translated into thoughts? But I think you answered that in your commentary in the end by saying that everything is, intellectual in a way. These are logoi, and the conglomeration of qualities is a kind of byproduct. Okay, so if physicality is a byproduct of an intellective universe, why have sense organs at all? Why doesn't the soul directly pick up the information from the intellective aspect of the other things? Why do we need the mediation of the sense organs?
I think the simple answer would be, a version of the principle of planetary, right? That things inevitably unfold necessarily. The soul gives rise to the physical body, or the soul gives rise to nature, which gives rise to physical bodies, which give rise to the qualities that emanate as secondary qualities of those things. So in another way, it's exactly the same question that Plotinus asks elsewhere when he says, would you really like everything to be locked up in the one? That would be a kind of grudging of the one's influence. So the one, necessarily, this is the oddness about the one, it has ultimately free will, but it cannot help but emanate beyond it. And so the cosmos cannot help but be emanated all the way down to physical things. Now, physical things have real effects, right? They have real physical effects. This one part of the job of the soul is to care for the body, which has been emanated and given to it as an object of care. So, and this gets back to the argument in 2.7, where he asks questions like, well, why can't one thing go through another? If everything is just thoughts out there, I can think about, walking through that wall. Why shouldn't I? If it's just merely a matter of obviously incorporeal thoughts, anything could possibly happen. And so in the last part of 2.7, he has to argue that, in fact, there are certain conglomerations of qualities which he says gives rise to onkos, to bulk, to resistance, to somatic, to corporeality, right? So those things are the things that the body, that the embodied soul is going to encounter, right? So it's going to encounter things which, even though they are thoughts, can also, an arrow can pierce the body, and it can pierce the body because it is this conglomeration of onkos, of resistance, of kind of, it's not material. Matter doesn't contribute anything to the solidity of bodies at all. Plotinus insists on that. But the particular kind of emanated secondary qualities from the logoi that let's say constitute an arrow means it can pierce flesh, right? And so that's one of the reasons why the soul, which is both fallen into the body and is glorified by being in the body, that's its peculiar task, to be in the body and look after a body, has to be aware of the things around it. Does that make sense?
I think it's helpful, but I'm not sure it answers my question. So my question was, I mean, I don't doubt that there are physical qualities. The question is, why does the soul need to operate at the level of the body through the sense organs? And why doesn't it pick up the information directly by being intellectual itself at the intellectual aspect of the thing, the logos? Why doesn't it perceive the logoi? Why does it have to go through this, through the bodily apparatus? That was the question.
Okay, that's a good question. And I think that is a good question. I have to speculate a little bit here, I think. If we knew the logos of an arrow, right? If we were aware of the logos of an arrow, we wouldn't be aware of the particularity by which it can injure me individually, right? And there's a way in which, since for the Plotinus, the fantasia is not a separate organ or not a quasi-physical organ as it is for the lady Neoplatonists, it simply is just the set of innate notions that are activated through connected with the logos. There's a way in which we end up with a perception, with a memory of the arrow as essentially a logos of the arrow. But in our actual encounter with the arrow, we do, I think, someone help me out here, but I think we do have to encounter it through its qualities, right? As when being embodied, the soul will have announced to it by the eyes, by the flesh, and so on, that there is this thing which has these qualities, including the ability to pierce through other matter, and so on. The body, the soul will end up with a kind of perception of the logos, but the composite between soul and body will react by taking action against the arrow, dodging out of the way, or whatever else. That's as best as I can understand why we need to. I think that's why we need to perceive qualities qua sensible. On the other hand, again, flipping the question the other way and taking a more phenomenological approach to it, we obviously do, right? We obviously do, in fact, encounter things as colors, shapes, things that can have impressions on our skin, and so on. Since we do encounter things that way, the challenge is for Plotinus to explain how his account of the soul perceiving things, as you say, correctly, primarily through the logoi, nevertheless also allows the whole qualia of what in fact is our experience of the world to emerge.
I don't want to monopolize, but I think this is very helpful. I think it's very helpful. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
I mean, the idea of composition. I was just thinking whether what you say and what Plotinus might mean is that there is this double aspect of the world, at once physical and at the other intellective. And that's the problem. I mean, changing visions is the kind of aporia that we have as we enter into the body and we are confused, whereas it's the same one world, and the intellective aspect, the physical aspect, is just the same reality, but it's this double aspect, and the physicality of it all at the body kind of confuses us in a way. I just was wondering whether that might be, the big picture behind it, which would be fascinating. But
that's absolutely correct. I mean, because what is the world, according to Plotinus, but a collection of logoi, right? The collection of logoi on the surface of matter, not enmattered in any way, but lying he uses this word, I can't remember the word he uses, but it's the same word that Aristotle uses elsewhere for maggots appearing in rotten meat. Like they appear on the surface, right? That's where logoi kind of float on the surface of matter. But logoi, being intelligibles, have a secondary activity, which is their qualities. And that's why the world presents itself to us in two different aspects, one of which is qualitative, which we can only get through the announcing of the impassible sense organs to the soul, and one of which is logos. And in some sense, it's just a matter of fact of nature that that's what the world presents itself to us as, and Plotinus has to explain that, but also it fits within his metaphysics that that's the way the world can in fact show up to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other?
Hello, can you hear me? Don't you
Yes.
think that Plotinus is very keen to reduce matter to something immaterial? I mean, he doesn't like any kind of raw stuff. It's all reduced to a very subtle kind of negative ontology. I think, in a sense, the question Isidoros is asking could go very, very far, because it could end up with the question, why is there anything at all, rather than the pure simplicity of the one? And you remember the mystics of the 17th century who said that it were best that nothing existed, but since the world exists, since it has been created, the second best is that it become annihilated in God. This is Conran, who is a very Christian thinker. There you are.
But that's precisely what Plotinus argues against in the Gross Schrift, right? The Gross Schrift is intended as an argument against Gnostics who say it would be better if the world hadn't been made, right? So, Plotinus, and I probably argue this more than most Plotinus scholars, is not against bodies, right? He accepts the fact that bodies exist. They have as much reality as a body can have. Matter is a different question altogether. Matter is not corporeal. Matter is simply privation. It has no role whatsoever in the constitution of bodies. And this is not, and it is evil, but this is not to be anti-body, because bodies are not connected with matter for Plotinus. They at most kind of float on the top of matter, and matter grasps them but can't hold on to them. So I actually think, and I just kind of hinted this at the beginning, that I really do believe that Porphyry has not helped us by reordering the Enneads so that we go from questions of embodiment of the soul at the beginning to the high points of metaphysics and the one at the end. I think the purpose of Plotinus' metaphysics, for a large extent, was to deal with embodiment and was to deal with bodies. And if we look at how Porphyry describes the arguments in the Roman school of Plotinus, they're almost all questions about bodies and the embodiment of the soul. That's the thing that the students knew about. And as we learn from that famous passage, when Porphyry questioned Plotinus for 3 days, or however long Porphyry bored everyone around him with the question about how was the soul connected with the body, it's only when he finally got the answer right that Plotinus gave him access to the writings, right? And so there's a way in which the fundamental questions of the school were about getting embodiment right. And then once you got embodiment right, you could then move on to the metaphysics, which I believe was there. And if we rearrange, if we don't take the Porphyrian order of the Enneads, I think the metaphysics there is there largely to explain why we live in this embodied world in which we find ourselves. Even when we get to the high reaches of the sixth Ennead, not all of it. Some of it is quite abstract, but a lot of the sixth Ennead itself still begins with embodiment and still begins with, how do we get to the one? How do we get through to the one? We start with our bodies. We start with the experience of embodiment. So I guess I would argue strongly against the idea that Plotinus was anti-body. I think he's a philosopher who is entirely concerned with the nature of the body and everything else flows from that. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I've always been puzzled by the usage of the term poikilos in Plotinus. That the variegated, colourful, And also, I mean, in 5.8, the analogy he uses of the agalmata for the ideas, which I mean, presumably this is an image of the ancient temples, which, as we know, would be pretty colourful.
Yeah. So I mean, anyone who spends time with Plotinus knows that even when he gets very abstract, he's very sensible. Right. So when he's describing what nous is like, is that it's in 5.8? I can't remember if it's 5.8 or 5.5, but it's quite good. Yeah, but there's another passage in which he talks about what is nous like. Imagine a flavor that brings together the flavor of wine and food and all the other things, the smells, and it's profoundly sensual. And so he again starts from kind of bodily experience, analogized from that, and nous is going to be like that.
And isn't maybe one way of bringing together that and the metaphysics, this article that I've mentioned on a number of occasions, so some of you might be a bit like Ben, will have heard this number of occasions, but there's this great article by Rudolf Schweitzer, the Swiss scholar, called the twofold. The twofold vision of Plotinus.
Okay.
And he calls it the aktuelle Sicht or the gegenständliche Sicht. So as it were, the existential perspective and the ontological perspective, basically. Right. So with Plotinus, you always have to bear in mind that sometimes he's talking about the ascent to the first principle, and then on other occasions he's giving you his ontology.
Yeah.
And of course, when he's giving an account of what Schweitzer calls the actual, das Aktuelle, the experiential, then of course you've got this very strong emphasis on the phenomenological. And how is this actually the soul is exactly experiencing? So he actually is emphasizing this very strongly experiential dimension to Plotinus's metaphysics, alongside his intention to delineate, a system of the metaphysical structure.
Yeah, and I think that's and the important thing, if coming out of this account, I suppose, is that of course, the ontological is always framed in terms of the activity of the soul, right? The activity of the soul to move upwards, to contemplate higher. And in the modern scholarship, I think the experiential is based into kind of passivity, right? It is also active. And it's active in much the same way. It's not a different kind of activity of the soul. And in fact, I should have made it more clear that in 4.6, the activity of the soul, which is memory, is really the same as the activity of the soul, which is sense perception. They're just acting on different kinds of objects, and that's why dimness and distance and so on apply equally to both those kinds of applications of the same power of the soul.
Yeah. You know, we are very fond of the great Alexandrian Roman thinker in this place, but I think your particular expertise in the history of science has brought a dimension to Plotinus that few of us were conscious of in quite the same way. So you were really illuminating that.
Thank you very much.